Professor Mark Caprio, who's a member of the College of Intercultural Communication at Rikkyo University in Tokyo, Japan. His primary theme of research is modern Korean history, with an emphasis on Korea's 20th century history of colonial subjugation, division, and liberation, and the colonial Cold War influences on contemporary Korean issues. He's the author of Japanese Assimilation Policies in Korea, 1910 to 1945, by University of Washington Press, and co-editor of Japan as the Occupier and the Occupied at Palgrave Macmillan in 2015. He's presently researching two projects, colonial dregs in the post-liberation Korea, and war museums, victimhood, and collective memory, all of which is highly relevant for us. And this is the title of his talk. Mark, please.
Let's see. This is a microphone. I should use this, I guess, huh?
You can use whatever you want.
I'll talk loud, and if I can't hear.
Is this working? Just make sure that it's...
That's just for the film, I think. Yeah.
So red? Okay, so maybe, yeah.
Okay, I've got to sort of switch between here and here.
We can put it there if you want.
Oh, okay.
If you prefer to sit.
Nah, Italians have to use their hands.
Exactly.
I'd like to thank you for the invitation to give a talk here. Jerusalem or Israel has been the #1 place I'd like to visit in the world, and this is an excellent opportunity for me. Unfortunately, because of actions of the United States, there's a lot of trepidation about visiting Israel in my international studies department, who are trying to establish relations with you, I understand. He comes up to me, "Are you really going to Israel?" And I said, "Yes, I'm going to Israel. I don't care if I die here. I want to. This is a promised land." Then right after I said that, for the first time in my life, I'm reading the New York Times, and you have perhaps the two hottest places in the world side by side talking about potential war, Jerusalem and North Korea. At the same time, I'm really getting, okay, if I go to Jerusalem and something happens in Tokyo, I'm safe. If Kim Jong-un tries to do something, or either way, you're just go with the flow and just...
stay in Tel Aviv, Mark.
Well, if worst comes to worst, I stay in Tel Aviv and not go to Jerusalem, which is also an interesting, it's definitely an interesting trip as well. It's a very interesting city. The title of my talk is here, and I want to emphasize Southern Korea. We're not talking about Northern Korea. Well, first we're talking about not South Korea, but Southern Korea mostly. Until 1948, there was Southern and Northern. Southern was occupied by the United States. Northern Korea was occupied by the Soviet Union. The division came, I emphasize this because Americans don't know why there's two Koreas. They don't know that the United States drew the line in the sand saying 38th parallel north is Soviet territory, and the south is American territory to get Seoul in the American zone. And they're supposed to put the two halves back together. Didn't happen. That's another part of this research that I'm doing right now. Northern Korea also had its collaborators. They handled them much better than the South, but you also see political implications about who was convicted and who was allowed to remain. I don't know too much about this history, but the little I do know suggests it's very political, who got treated as what, who got purged and who got allowed to remain, but that's not my emphasis today. The shifting borders comes around 1948, 49, when traitor, the word, the definition of traitor in Southern Korea shifts from somebody who collaborated with the Japanese to someone who may be sympathetic towards the enemy to the north, the communist or the leftist feeling. So the shifting, the legalization of traitor switches as well, and I'll be talking about that. Okay, so we go. These are the issues I want to consider. I'm going to apologize in advance. I don't have a conclusion to this paper, and I'm hoping maybe in our discussion after we can come to some conclusion about how to, especially the third one here, social needs for identifying these people. Something in my paper, if you read, you see perhaps it's lacking, and something I'm trying to work in my mind for this, the idea of collaboration. But the issues I'd like to consider and to propose temporary conclusions to problems ascertaining to the social identity of the collaborator versus those who resist. Are we talking about two extremes, or something as a very narrow distinction about who resisted the Japanese, why somebody would resist the Japanese, and why somebody would collaborate with them? We think of them as two polar opposites, but it's really, according to one Korean scholar whose name I forget, I can't remember where I read this, it's a very thin line between the two, okay, the haves or the have-nots. If you have something, you're going to collaborate to keep what you have. If you don't have something, you might as well join the resistance and fight for it. The line that separates the guilt of collaboration versus simply the mundane collaboration. Almost all people collaborated to some extent in some way. You paid your taxes, you're collaborating with the Japanese. You buy something from a Japanese store, you're collaborating, you're assisting the Japanese there. Things you really can't avoid. Then you have the other side of people who bought the Japanese line, thinking that the East Asian sphere of influence, this confederation of East Asian states, is a good idea for Korea, and you see yourself as becoming Japanese, assimilating as Japanese. What acts need to be prosecuted as traitorous collaboration or not? This is a big question of the Koreans after the war, after liberation. We'll talk about this not as after war or post-war, but post-liberation from the Japanese, but occupation by the American military. And then the big problem, the social needs for identifying and disciplining the guilty. What does this do for society? Why should society care about these people? Not after the war, we can sort of understand that, but I forgot that I put something here, yeah. In the Korea's case, even after they're dead and gone, this is 2004, we'll talk about an effort to identify who the collaborators were after they're all dead and buried. Why is this important for society to identify them at this stage, okay? So these are the main issues. We'll come back to these at the end. Okay, very simple. What is a collaborator? We go to the dictionary. It's a very innocent word that's used in, it can be taken in different ways. A person who works with another person to create or produce something as a book. So we're all collaborating, I hope, in the end, to find answers to the question. Then there's the other, a person who helps the enemy in war when they're taking control of another person's company, and occupiers helping the occupiers. And then the traitor is someone who betrays their friends, their country, etc. So we're really dealing with these kinds of nuances for someone who helps for a positive purpose and someone who helps for a negative purpose. The problem with this is, in the Korea's case, you really can't identify someone as a collaborator until after you have a Korea for which they're acting against. The Koreans today will say, well, there's a Korean identity that they are betraying during this time. So Korea has a long history of 4,000 years, or they tell their history as such. But in the Korean in 1860s, 1870s, 1880s was their identity as such. We'll look at one character, Yoon Chi-ho, as a case study for this. And we'll try to make this rather problematic. So the assumptions of collaborators are such. It's voluntary rather than coerced. Okay, if you're coerced to do something, you're forced to join the military for this. This isn't really collaboration. You volunteer to do this. And I think I have something in between, yes. But can you measure this after the fact? So you have someone who collaborated and you bring them to trial, and they're, of course, the situation has changed, the political atmosphere has changed, and they say, well, I didn't volunteer to do this. I was coerced into volunteering, or I was forced to volunteer for this. How do you measure this after the fact? The national identity of the collaborator and the occupier are different. Okay, so if you're a Korean or any working within your own government collaborating, that's not a crime, but this is the enemy. So there have to be a distinction made between the us and the them. How does this factor into the colonial situation when the accused considers us and them to be technically the same? So you take a person like Yunji Ho, who was rather old at the time, no sense that the Japanese would leave. You've got a life to live, an identity. How we are the same as the Japanese, more or less. They're occupying us. Is it collaboration? Can you consider that collaboration at a time when the two are the same? 1945, the situation changes. Japanese loses the war. Korea is liberated. Then you can identify people as having collaborated with the enemy after that. The primary purpose between collaboration to help the enemy rather than indirectly helping fellow nationals. And you get the excuse. This became infamous in French, the Vichy government saying, well, we were helping the Germans so that we could help France in the long run. Was he accused of assisting the enemy to prevent a greater evil? And so many of the Koreans would say, well, by helping the Japanese, we were able to control the situation a little better and help our fellow countrymen in an indirect way. I think the Vichy, I forget who the French guy was, he said, well, we can, by helping the Germans, we saved French Jews at the sacrifice of other Jews who they were taken out. And so they didn't buy that argument, and I think he was executed anyway. But this is another problem with this. I won't talk, but one of my students is looking at a lady named Helen Kim, who ran a girls' school, Ewha University, or Ewha Schools, and she said she collaborated with the Japanese to save her school. This kind of argument we have, and is she guilty of collaboration for that? Action deserving of punishment, more serious than mundane activities or those necessary for survival. Is individual survival okay if it helps prevent the sacrifice of the larger group? So many people collaborate for their own survival, okay, and in all situations. Okay, so how do you measure the value of the individual versus the group? So if you say the individual, you're working for the individual, does it sacrifices the group? Is this collaboration or not? It's a difficult decision to make. Rather easy for us, of course, I'd work towards a group, but when you're put in the situation, I don't know how I would answer that question if I was there. These are just some of the assumptions that I've come up with in studying collaboration. So World War II era collaboration examples. There's every occupation had a collaboration of some sort in Axis Germany, Japan, Italy, wartime collaboration. There's French collaborators, Czechoslovakia, Poland, all of these. I don't have to go through the list. These are considered, after the war, they were prosecuted. I've read the book about Czechoslovakia, Czech collaborators, and they were notorious for having the trial one day and finding them guilty, finding them worthy of the death penalty, giving them one chance for an appeal. That appeal lasted one day, then they'd execute them. I think 78 to 80% of the people in Czechoslovakia accused of collaboration were actually put to death, which is a very high figure, especially when compared to the Koreans, we'll see in a minute. But collaboration for the Allied, the victors, of course. I don't know much about Indian collaboration who fought the war during World War II, helped the British. I don't think they're considered in this light. Maybe they are, but I haven't heard much about this. Burma, Malaya, things like that. The US and the Philippines, of course, the victors, the collaboration is still collaboration, but not considered a crime as it was with the Axis powers, including Japan. How were they dealt with? The kangaroo courts in Eastern Europe, loss of civil rights, property loss, imprisonment, or the death penalty. And then in France, I think it's a rather famous story of the women who serviced the Germans. They were paraded down the street naked with swastikas in their back, embarrassed in that way. And then there's, of course, people who escape punishment, many exposed decades after the fact. So various ways that Europe took care of it. Very brutal, and we'll find that, of course, Japan was defeated months after, and the US did not allow the Koreans to prosecute collaborators. And I'm wondering, to what extent did this influence the US decision to, we'll say they vetoed the legislation to bring these people to trial. And the brutality of the European situation might, whether it influenced the future Korean chances is something I'm still looking for evidence. Okay, the case of Korea. Very different from the kinds of collaboration that we're talking about. The occupation was much longer than the German occupation, of course, 35 years. And you see a very diverse form of collaboration from the people who signed. There was 5 traders, and they always compare them to the Irish traders. I'm not sure about that history, but they signed the Treaty of Annexation in 1910. This allowed Japan to legally occupy Korea or annex Korea. And these are the number 5, the 5 notorious traders of this period. Then others who refused to participate in the March 1st, 1919 independence movement. This was right after World War I. Woodrow Wilson puts forth his 14 points. And amongst them was the one of self-determination. People have a right to determine their future, their government. And the Koreans took this as a sign that if they revolted, the Americans would come and help them. One of the leaders of the independence movement was a guy named Syngman Rhee, who was the first president. He was Woodrow Wilson's student at Princeton and felt that his professor would come to his assistance, which Woodrow Wilson had no, this was for the defeated German former colonies, not for the, they wasn't looking at Korea. And then those who offered wartime assistance, okay? We'll see that Yun Chi-ho, the guy we'll talk about, is found guilty of the last 2, refusal to participate and then wartime assistance to the Japanese. There's also, people bring up a case of a weaker sense of national identity amongst the Koreans. Koreans, during the process of them becoming a modern state, the Japanese move in, nationalism was not fully developed. Those who were leading the reform movement were not respected by the government, the Confucius government in hand, and they're basically, they put forth an effort, and it was basically squelched by the government, and they went back to the conservative Confucian center. And then Japanese assimilation policy. A question I'm dealing with, to what extent does assimilation more or less create this resistance versus collaboration response to a greater extent than other kinds of colonization where the assimilation is not the policy. So you get policy dividing Koreans at a greater extent. You're either resisting becoming Japanese or you're accepting becoming Japanese, and this has greater reverberations in the post-war, post-liberation period. You've got people who definitely changed their name or assisted the Japanese war effort versus those who are trying to kill Japanese and working against them, basically battling against each other once the liberation, the American occupation began from August 1945 to August 1948. So this is just a brief outline of the case. It's a very complicated system in Korea at the time, particularly because you have a divided Korea, and you've got the problem of the North, the South, 2 different ideologies, and the 2 sides that are controlling it not being able to agree on the means to bring them together. Okay, here's Yun Chi-ho. You can see he lived from 1864 to 1940, rather long life, died months after liberation. He's sort of a hero to me because he wrote this extensive diary, and it covers 11 volumes. And I remember going to the University of Washington library and dusting off the cover and seeing it in Korean or in Hanja, the Chinese characters, Yun Chi-ho diary. And I said, okay, get out the dictionary and start working on this. This is an important person. And I opened it up and I learned he was trying to practice his English. And he wrote the entire, the first few volumes he wrote in Chinese, and then he switched to English. Another important thing about Yun Chi-ho, and I'll introduce him better in a minute or 2, he was involved in many of the reform movements by Koreans. And so he goes from, his history goes right from the beginning of what you might call the effort to modernize Korean society all the way to the end of the war. And you see the switches, the changes in his life, and we're trying to figure out the reasons why he moved from A to B to whatever you want to shift. But we'll get to that in a second. First, he was born of the Seoul class. I don't know if that's the right pronunciation. This is the descendants of concubines to a prominent man in the military class, Now, in Korean society, people of this and a few other categories were not allowed to take, say, the exams to reach prominent positions. For some reason, his father was respected by the king, and he did gain positions, but he was more or less discriminated against throughout his life because of his background. For example, in 1881, he enjoyed, this is a terrible translation of the tour, but somehow they call it the gentleman's tour, of a group of Koreans who went to Japan from 81 to learn about modernity, and also probably to check and see what the Japanese were doing behind the Koreans' back. They were very concerned about, they remembered Hideyoshi's invasions in the 1590s, which basically tore through Korea. They were wondering if something else was going to happen. If you're a Japanese historian, you might know of the Iwakura mission. Some people compare it to this mission that went around the world looking at all of the major capitals of Europe. It's a tour I want to take when I retire. Every prominent place in Europe they went, and they collected information. So this only went to Japan. They left students, like Yun Chi-ho is left at Doshisha University, which is a very prominent Protestant university in Kyoto, to study. A number of other people were left here to study about Japan and bring the information back. Just, this is off the talk, but one of the differences between this gentleman's tour and the other Iwakura mission is the Iwakura mission sent people who could return to Japan and make a difference. Ito Hirobumi, the most prominent Japanese politician or political figure, was on that tour. They were part of the government when they returned. The gentleman's tour people were not respected by the government. They were not part of the central government. They were not able to use the ideas, what they learned when they returned to Korea. In 83, he joins the first U.S. Council. U.S. and Korea signed the treaty in 1882, and Lucius Fute was the council, and he was his translator. He participated in a coup that lasted 3 days, had to leave Korea, went to Shanghai to study, then went to U.S. Vanderbilt Emory College in Tennessee to study, and then returns around 1886 to join the Independence Club, which was probably the most successful reform movement in this period. Lasted a couple of years. They started a newspaper, The Independent, which he was the editor of. They did things that made differences in Korea at the time, but 98 they were disbanded by the government, or by the king, and it ended. The Japanese occupy or annex Korea in 1910, and immediately they have the Governor General Terauchi decides that he wants, I think he invented it, there may have been a plot somewhere to assassinate him, and so he starts arresting over 1,000 Koreans, puts 105 Koreans on trial, and then 5 of them are found guilty and imprisoned, and one of them is Yun Chi-ho. So you've got the guy, we'll stop for a second. He's not really, if you can consider whether this guy had an affinity for a Korean identity after all he'd been through, you might think there's problems with that. Because his idea of what the Koreans were, if the king had listened to what they were trying to do, maybe Korea could have avoided colonization, perhaps. He writes about this in his diaries. He's very, very brutal about Kojo and the king. He has nothing good to say about this guy after. Then he's imprisoned by the Japanese. And so we'll see in a minute that he spends most of his time, his life, the remaining of his life, looking over his shoulder to see what the Japanese are thinking. How can he avoid disturbing disturbing him. He's become a Christian by this time. He speaks multiple languages. He has many foreign friends, so he's got a couple of strikes against him, especially during the war years. Okay, I'm not trying to prove him guilty or innocent. I'm just saying it's a more complicated case than he's given. So 1915 till the 1930s, involved in activities with Christian churches, YMCA, education institutions. I don't have it here, but his diary is filled with him entertaining prominent Japanese at the Chosun Hotel, which is still the most prominent hotel in Seoul, I believe. Most expensive. It's a Westin hotel now, but this was the elite hotel in Seoul. He's very rich, by the way. He's taking them to dinner and wining and dining them. Late 30s and 40s, he's accused of helping the Japanese recruit Koreans for the military, doing things that help the Japanese cause. Okay, so we're going to turn this into a court case and to see what the verdict is of the jury here. In 1919, he's one of those who rejects the invitations to join the March First movement. You have a series of 33 Koreans who signed this Declaration of Independence, and they present it to the Japanese. They say they want them to leave. And he rejects this participation in this. And then he has the audacity to interview with the Japanese newspaper where he tells everything. He says, I refuse to join this movement. And he's actually telling the Japanese that he's not involved with this problem, this movement. Again, he regularly entertains Japanese officials at the Swank Chosun Hotel. He's critical of Korean people in general in his diary. So we'll see some of his entries. In 1930, early 1940s, he adopts the Japanese name, and then he receives 6 bottles of juice by the Governor General for his cooperation. So, you know, he's getting rewarded for doing something. He's the kind of guy that if he does something and people know about it, you're going to get people they're going to join this bandwagon. He's a very well-known person. Assisted Japanese in military mobilization. He's recruiting Koreans. He has articles in the newspaper telling Koreans how to participate in the Japanese war effort, these kinds of things. And then he's admitted to the Japanese House of Peers, which is, of course, something the emperor appoints you to. You're not elected to this, okay? Oh, I'm sorry, I forgot this. He clearly states Korea's shortcomings, and et cetera, et cetera. So here are some of the things in his diary. In 1:13:20, he says the people, the Koreans who can't run a decent restaurant, want to run an independent state, these kinds of things. One of the material benefits of the Japanese rule in Korea is the good roads. They show that they have brains, yet most Koreans haven't brains enough to appreciate good roads when they see them. His diary is filled with criticisms of the Koreans. He's also saying, though, and we'll get to this, he's saying if the Japanese just teach us how to do this, then we can be an independent state, okay? But we need the Japanese to help us do this. Now we turn to the defense. We could go on and on and on with the prosecution. They have plenty of evidence from his diary. And we'll see how that might be different. So first, I think we have to look at the age of how old he was at the time of annexation, 46, if my math is correct. Then the Pacific War, when it starts, he's 77. He's an old man. He can't foresee Korea liberated from Japan. Does that factor into our discussion of whether he's guilty or not? This is the reality. I'm living in Korea. This is what I have to put up. How do I make the best of this? Pre-annexation activities to modernize Korea. He had, in his newspaper, they had many ideas that Korea should take to, many to follow what Japan has been doing, but others, this is how you become a liberated state without foreign influence. And Japan, or Korea at the time, was being influenced by the Russians, by the Chinese, of course, and the Russians. Then the US had some influence. The Japanese had very strong influence. And so they're basically saying that Korea, to become an independent sovereign state, has to be Korea for the Koreans, not for the Russians or the Japanese or things like that. very hard for these. The king rejected them. To what extent does this affect his identity? Okay, if if you're collaborating against an idea of Korea, where does the idea of Korea enter into Yoon Chi-ho's thinking is something that has to be considered, I think. His arrest and torture by the Japanese for the suspicious plot to assassinate the Japanese governor general. How much does that affect his life after, what he does with the Japanese after? I don't see him as a very strong person, the kind of guy who's going to fight even though, against heavy odds. He seems like someone who sort of bends with the flow, goes with the flow, and you're not going to see him trying to go against this. The belief that his main belief that the Koreans must strengthen first to make liberation successful. Time better spent studying than yelling Mansei. Mansei is, how would you translate that? Is in Japanese is banzai. Long live the emperor. There's no emperor though. Sort of long live Korea. Yeah, it's an expression of, we are Koreans and we're going to fight this. And that's what they yelled during the street when they're protesting in 1919 against the Japanese. So he's basically saying, hey, you want to improve Korea? Stick in the school. Don't fight the impossible odds. The Japanese are not going to leave if you just yell Mansei. That's not going to throw them out. Also, he's very critical of Japanese rule in his diary. So it wasn't that he was totally anti-Korean and pro-Japanese. He had some expressions that were pro-Japanese, but he had reserved plenty of space to criticize the Japanese as well. And then, of course, going back to his arrest and torture, the possible fear of Japanese retribution, possible effect of this had in his diary writing. He has, is it 13 volumes? I forget. His last volume is so different from his other ones. It's sort of, he's more balanced here. Then all of a sudden he goes very much towards pro-Japanese. And I'm wondering, is he writing for himself, or is he writing for the Japanese police in case he's arrested? So the Japanese police would arrest someone. They know he has a diary. They would confiscate the diary and look for evidence one way or the other. Is he writing to save his butt in case he's arrested is a question I've always asked. It's just too much to one side. So his defense, he joined many reform movements, the Independence Club, managed and wrote the first patriotic newspaper with an English section in it and all that. He wrote the Korea's national anthem as well. Supported a logical Korean approach to the Japanese Japanese rule. Self-strengthening through education is something that a number of Koreans who preached at the time. We can't get rid of the Japanese. We should strengthen ourselves, and then when we can rule a country, when we can govern a country by ourselves, that's when we should seek our sovereignty. Koreans in the military. To many Koreans, this was a sign of progression. The Japanese were accepting Koreans as their equal. Okay, they're allowing Koreans as well to fight in the military. So myself, I think of going to the military as the worst possible. Well, I know you have to go to the military here, but in my case, I was very happy that they ended the draft in the United States when I turned 18. But for some people that were looked at as inferior to the Japanese, to some Koreans it suggested that the Japanese were finally considering them as equals. Okay, I can only equate this to going to meetings in Japan where I used to protest that they would not include me in meetings. And then when I started going to meetings, I realized there was a different side of it. But being considered equal to the Japanese colleagues was a goal of mine at the time. So if they have to suffer through meetings, I should suffer as well. And now I protest them because they're too long. Japanese meetings are terrible. But at any rate, that's as close as I can equate to this. But many Koreans saw this as an uplifting of their people at the time. Here are some of the things he writes about in his diary. felt that he had to attend the events. They made him attend events like the emperor's birthday parties at the governor general's residence. If he didn't show up, they would come to his house and inquire why he missed the events. In May 23rd, 38, he visits the governor general's office to tell him my reasons for not entering the Privy Council. So he later had to join, but in 1938 he was trying to avoid being admitted into this little club here. In 530, going back a bit to 31, when he attends these events, he said, I feel like a drop of oil in a bucket of water, but the Japanese war psychology are classifying friends and foes. A Korean like me can't afford to be listed as a foe. His religion, his language abilities, his contacts. Why he changed his name, I could not afford to make my boys blacklisted. So he had boys in school, and he felt that if he didn't change his name, it would affect their lives as well. So he has a defense for all of these. But unfortunately, he was listed on all of these. He's at the top of the list of all of the lists that label people as collaborators for the reasons given. Basically, he refused to join the March 1st movement, and then his activities during the war, okay? So there's been three major events or movements to solve the collaboration problem in Korea. All of them have failed. They have not been able to prosecute anybody. 1947, of course, was the first. They had an interim National Assembly was formed of, let's see, was it 90? I forget the exact number of Koreans. This was the first step towards reunification. The Soviet side would make their National Assembly. The South would make theirs, and then the two sides would negotiate reunification. This never happened. Elections in the South took place in May 1948. And then 1948, after the formation of the Republic of Korea, they had a National Assembly. Legislation was formed, and one of the first tasks was to debate how to end this collaboration problem. And that failed. We'll talk about that in a minute. And then 2004, when the dictatorship had ended, you have liberal governments coming into Korea for a short time. The President Roh Moo-hyun started this Truth and Reconciliation project to look at the collaboration problem, but many different colonial-era problems, the dictatorship problems from 1948 to 1988, to locate missing people, find out what happened to people who disappeared during this time. Whole bunch of projects. One of these was a collaboration project. They put a book, I've got them in my office, there's something like 23 volumes of biographies of collaborators. And a massive project, but we'll talk about that in a minute. So three basic movements to end this, and they all eventually failed. So the first, in 1947, the US military government was obviously monitoring this. They came up with a draft of the legislation, and the US vetoed it. They held veto power over this interim National Assembly, and they felt that this was not a good idea for Koreans to be prosecuting or bringing to trial people who were suspected of collaboration with the Japanese. The 1948 legislation was cut short by the Republic of Korea government. It lasted 1 year, and then Syngman Rhee basically said, oh, this is it, enough is enough. We're not going to continue this. And that's where you get the heavy, the switch to the national security law and the hunt for people who were sympathetic towards the North. It's a long history of the problems with Southern Korea. Then in 2004, ended after a change to conservative rule in 2008. Of course, everybody who had lived during the colonial period, for the most part, was dead anyway, so they couldn't bring anybody to trial, but they were after Koreans, their descendants who had benefited from their ancestors' rule by land. If the person had gained land during the colonial period, they wanted to confiscate this land, this property at this time. but this ended rather quickly. So the issues, if you look at the debates that took place in the Interim National Assembly and the National Assembly from 1948, they basically talked about the same questions when they're trying to define who should be part of this, considered guilty of collaboration. First, what working definition of collaborator to use? What kinds of crimes did they commit to qualify them, if that's a good word, as collaborators? And then who to include in this definition? So you have person A who was teaching in a school, a Japanese school. So how about his family and even his students? Should these people be included as well? I think part of these arguments, they're trying to delay the process, so people would put out ridiculous examples just to keep the debate going, so they delay the legislation and perhaps it would disappear into the sunset. And then what acts were deserving of punishment. And then in the inclusion of should the post-liberation acts be considered as well? So remember, there's left and right, people of left and right ideological beliefs in these committees. Some of them are saying people who helped the Americans should be considered collaborators. Obviously, people to the left felt that. People to the right said, well, how about the people, the leftist persuasions who are battling the people causing trouble in Korea? Should these people be considered as well? And then there's other people who benefited, the opportunists who were able to use the void in power to gain something from the system after liberation. Should these people also be considered in this whole this issue? Mostly with the 1948, but also 1947. And then again, if they profited, how much profit should they have gained before we investigate them? So there's people, just gained a little bit, or some people gained a lot. U.S. military interference throughout this. What's that?
Just thinking about this factor, that's all.
Okay. The first mistake the U.S. made was in maintaining Japanese trained Koreans in position of power, mainly the police, from 1945, August 1945. And so MacArthur in Tokyo decrees, one of his first decrees, saying the Japanese and the Japanese trained Koreans should maintain their positions after liberation. And then until we train Koreans who are capable of filling these posts. Now, on one level, it sounds pretty reasonable. Keep the people who are experienced in power. We don't have people to raise them. There's a whole question I'm asking in probably another paper, what the U.S. could have done. They know they're going to occupy Korea, what they could have done to avoid this problem. And there were a number of Koreans who were working with the United States before the war. If they had brought them with them, could that have helped resolve this problem? You don't get that. You get them keeping the colonial government in power until the Koreans raised holy hell, the Koreans in the United States and Koreans in Korea, and they said, okay, well, the Japanese have to leave. And so the governor general was told he had to step aside, and a few other people. But you still see documents of Japanese working in their positions months after. The person who was the vice warden of Sodaemon prison, the most notorious prison in Seoul, finally got relieved in March 1946 or something. And he was vice warden probably because a United States official was the warden at the time. You get rumors that Korean or Japanese were still working with the Americans years after the event. And the police, of course, police working with the Japanese, once you have them entrenched in their positions, we'll see how later they were able to influence the politics of collaboration after. Then you get the United States criticizing informal Korean charges of collaboration. So you get a note from this Korean official in one of the Busan area, the southern area, saying that the Americans are just working with the collaborators, or not, they're being influenced by the wrong group of people. And then you see a little note scribbled in it. The Koreans believed anybody with property collaborated with the Japanese. They really don't know what collaboration is, which is probably a valid claim in some respects. And then, of course, they vetoed the interim legislation in 1947. Again, they were concerned that the Koreans didn't know what collaboration meant, how they weren't identifying, they weren't giving a proper definition of collaborator. And they were afraid this might turn into a bloodbath or a witch hunt or a witch kangaroo court of people that, a politically motivated kangaroo court to get rid of people they thought were collaborators. And again, this might have been influenced, sounds like it could have been influenced by the European example, just because the court cases I've read about are just senseless. We have to do something to get rid of people who helped the Nazis, and we're not really going to take the time to really try these people properly. And then you get strengthening of support of Japanese, and the Japanese trained Koreans over this period. Again, the Japanese, a little like Germany after the war as well, the anti-communist people who are staunch anti-communists were more valuable to the U.S. than the people who had fought or worked with the Japanese enemy before. And just a little break, you get this switch that I can't really identify days after the war of U.S. and Japanese showing more affinity than with Koreans. And this is a flight of Americans came in 3 days after the war. It's called the Eagle Project. They came in to look for POWs, and the Japanese wouldn't let them see the POWs, but they would get the fuel. They had fuel for a one-way trip. And so they had to spend the night there, and at the night they're having a drink-a-thon with the Japanese and Americans are having a drink-a-thon, drinking beer, singing Air Force songs, and the Japanese were thumping away and, on the desk, and then they're switching songs like this. This is days after they were killing themselves in Okinawa. And I can't understand, not having fought, maybe I'm missing something, but I don't know if I could be that conciliatory towards the enemy that soon. A number of other stories like that. Okay, and then after, from 1948, you have the Republic of Korea interference. You get the new government led by Syngman Rhee, supported by collaborator suspects. So the US keeps the collaborators, the people, the pro-Japanese Koreans in their positions, and Syngman Rhee comes in from the United States with the other members of this Korean provisional government. He's has an ambition to become president once the US allows elections, and he immediately surrounds himself by pro-Japanese collaborators, particularly the police, which sort of makes sense to me. I guess if you want to remain in power, if the police have so much power, it makes more sense to ally yourself with the power to get what you need. And quickly he turns to the new enemy at the gate, the north gate at the DPRK, how to prevent people from adopting or sympathizing with the North. You have different political campaign movements in the South fighting against each other, and a way to ally yourself with the conservative element, and then with Japan, alliance against the communist other that's growing. And then for the legislation, 1948, lack of support for legislation by the first ROK president. So he's basically gave a radio announcement around the time they enacted the legislation, saying it should be before anybody is sentenced to a penalty, that should be reviewed by the president himself, and then it should be carried out. In other words, to control this thing, to process, and he ends the hunt for collaborators in August 1949. So basically 1 year, less than 1 year, to identify, try and prosecute people guilty of helping the Japanese. And we get lists of people found guilty in this very short list. One person given the death penalty, which was never carried out as far as we know. Others, terms of prison sentences, and many not being allowed to exercise their civil rights. They weren't allowed to vote in elections, things like this.
How many know?
What's that? 30s or 40s or so. Yeah, very, 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 very small number. And to put it in better perspective, even in 1947, the head of this interim government, or the National Assembly, Kim Kyu-sik, said, this is a symbolic effort. We just have to make a symbolic effort to try some people, put them in jail, and then just get on with life to end this period. So it wasn't like they were going to arrest thousands of people and put them in jail and take care of them that way. It's basically a symbolic ending of this period. They needed something symbolic to end the period of colonization and then move on with life, is what he was saying. The birth of the National Security Act in 1948 is still in the books today, basically saying any Korean, South Korean, who shows sympathy towards the North is guilty of this crime and eligible for imprisonment. The latest, there's been others. So if a Korean goes to North Korea today, and there's a few people more knowledgeable about this than I am, if they go to North Korea today, this is the legislation that they would be tried against. There's been a few examples of people going to the North. When Kim Il-sung dies in 1994, there was a group of students who held a funeral service for him. They were arrested by this legislation. So it's still in the books. It still works for this. There's a whole bunch of other, it's a whole other story to talk about that. And then after Syngman Rhee is forced out by students in 1960, even after that, the presidents, Park Chung-hee and then others, basically blocked any effort for people to talk about this issue. Park Chung-hee book just came out about him by my senior at UW. He was notorious. He was in the Japanese military. He studied in the military academy, and so he might be eligible for this distinction of collaboration. So he had something to fight against. 2004, the Truth and Reconciliation Acts we talked about. The idea was, if you want to advance, you have to know your past. And this includes some of the crimes committed by Park Chung-hee and others. And then dealing with unresolved issues. Collaboration was one of them. Disappearances, thousands of Koreans who were leading the university disturbances, other way, were arrested by the police and never heard of again. And they wanted to find out what happened to these people. Colonial-era atrocities. The Ukishima Maru is one of these. There's a ship from northern Japan filled with Korean laborers who they were supposed to return to Busan, and it went into Maizuru Harbor, which is in the Kyoto prefecture, and it blew up in the sea there. Japanese say it was a landmine. Koreans still say the Japanese did this purposely, blowing up the ship. Thousands of Koreans, of course, dead. North Korea just came out with a movie, well, year 2000, they came out with a movie about this, and clearly identifying the Japanese as the culprits of this event. Still, I think the reason it continues is because there's so many unanswered questions that the Japanese aren't providing the documents needed to answer the questions, and when you hide the documents, suspicion arises even further. But these kinds of issues they wanted to resolve, and though you get this effort for collaborator hunting. And around this time, a number of books came out, 99 Most Notorious Collaborators, all of these books trying to identify collaborators, and the government finally took the lead and put out this massive collection of books on this. And the ultimate goal, I think, was to strip families of property gained through collaboration activities. There's the idea, and I'm not too sure about this, that the DMZ area, which is a big swath of land, some people who were responsible for this, they may have claims to the property there. The US military was going to leave the Seoul area and some of the property that they held once was perhaps some people who were guilty of collaboration might make claims to them. These kinds of things they were concerned about, I think. The issues here, of course, that all the collaborators are dead, only families would be punished, and you meet some of the family, the offspring of these, the granddaughters of these people, and they still feel the guilt. Their grandfather was listed on this Lee Kwang-soo, a most famous author in Korea. His granddaughter used to teach at the University of Washington. I met her once, and she's heartbroken that her grandfather was one of the most notorious collaborators on the list. And so it really affects the families today. Possible other targets, this came at a time when Japan ROK issues were rising in a negative way. The textbook issues, the Japanese were rewriting their textbooks to soften this period. Other issues, the Dokdo Takeshima problem, this island or this rock in the middle of the sea there, who owns it? And so this was another potential Japan ROK issue that they wanted to throw into the fire, perhaps. There's also a question of whether this was politically motivated. The main opposition to the president at the time was Park Kyung-hee. You might know her name. She just got impeached as president of the Republic of Korea, but she was the main opposition. She is Park Chung-hee's daughter. And so is there an implication by association with this? You had conservative opposition to this, particularly the issues with the Park Chung-hee disappearance, the lack of institutional support. The Korean CIA was very uncooperative in releasing documents for that era, and perhaps for this as well. And then it quickly ends with the 2008 change in government. The majority, the No-Tae-woo government, was not without its skeletons. The person chosen to lead a particular committee had to resign quickly because they found out his father was with the Japanese police before. So it seems not everybody, of course, but many people at the top levels, their ancestors were part of the top levels of the previous governments. Was that 5 minutes? I didn't know I had a timekeeper here. Okay, well, that's good. We'll get to the chase then. So there's many people that have hidden skeletons in this. Oh, that's perfect. We get to the issues of the talk. I didn't know it's the first time giving this talk. You don't know how it's going to. But what I've talked about before, what the reasoning behind these the collaborators. Why is it so important, especially now, to identify these people, given putting aside the potential political issues, but it seems important for Korean society and perhaps for other societies as well. And then we'll just go over these very quickly. My thinking of this, the immediate post-liberation period is rather easy. The factional ideological strife was centered on this. There were people still in government, and it made sense to purge them, at least, to get them and get Koreans who are untainted, if possible, in government, in these positions. And the fact that the relatively peripheral treatment of these given by the U.S. And then what the Koreans who are leading this, we need something symbolic statement to end this drag of the colonial period. That's basically the topic of my book, the dregs of colonial period that have lingered through the American occupation and even further, and the role that the United States has played in perpetuating this history where it could have changed it. Long term, the future, 2004, political friction, maybe perhaps to establish social parameters of post-democratized ROK. Democratization really took off from 1988 when you had popular election of presidents, and since this time they've tried to clear up a number of problems in this history, and this by defining traitors versus heroes, you're really setting parameters for the society in the future, as well as the problems that other dictators had perpetuated in Korea before that. Perhaps a preemptive measure to warn others in the future. You set the parameters by having these trials, and from now, that's where the talk ends, I guess. But it really, okay, with 2004 being a failure, does it make sense to keep this history alive? Thank you. Now you can clap. So I'd welcome questions, but I'd also welcome your ideas on the questions raised, and if I could get these, yeah.
Yes. Collaborators, contributors.
Let's all be collaborators of.
Danny.
So I'll be the first collaborator today.
Thank you.
Just introduce yourself, Danny.
Yeah, I'm Danny Orbach from Japanese History at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. And I'm interested in the memory of collaboration. Is a collaborator more denounced if he collaborated with the Japanese in a certain point of time and not in another? For example, is collaboration during the relatively liberal occupation regime in the 1920s the same as collaboration during the Second World War? Do the Korean post-war memory makes any difference?
That's a good question, and you don't, other than 1919, at least I have not read all 20-some volumes, so there may be some collaborations in the 1920s that I'm not aware of. But the wartime is the big one, which is interesting because the war wasn't between Korea and, it was between the US and Japan. And if a Korea, my favorite example is there's a group called the Paekjeong, which are the debased people of Korea, like the Barakmen of Japan. They were the people that took charge of the death profession, so burials, things like this. They were unclean people, and they were discriminated against in Korea and Japan for centuries. And this is
the same ethnic group?
Well, no, they're different, but they're very similar in how they're identified. So I don't know what the link is, but they're something maybe, I don't know. And the Korean group, according to one scholar, gained their liberation from this during the colonial period. So they really owe the mix-up, the social mix-up during the period to their liberation. And according to him, they no longer exist. Now, some people disagree with that. But a group of them sold or gathered money together and bought an airplane for the Japanese. And so the question I asked the authors is, what do you think of these people? And he's very much involved. He was responsible for a monument in the city of Jinju being constructed in their honor. And he said, well, there's some bad apples in every field. But my thinking is, what do they owe Korean society? Why should they remain loyal to a society that never really respected them? And not that they should turn to the Japanese, but it should be looked at something different. But he felt that they should be convicted as well as traitors to the Korean people, which sort of talks about the political edge of this today. But you don't get the 20s and the early 30s, there's really no problem as far as I can see. 1910, of course, 1919, and then 1938 to 1945. And the other periods, well, Korea was a little bit different. There was no wars. You don't get crimes being identified at that time.
Yes, please. I'm Noam Khabi, and I'm a historian of American foreign relations. Two questions, really not related. The first is, can you elaborate a little further on MacArthur's position regarding collaboration? And the second one is, what was the extent of intermarriage between Japanese and Koreans, and was there some social shaming involved afterwards?
Okay, and during?
Yeah.
MacArthur didn't have much, but he's not connected to Korea until 1950, during the war, of course. He comes, and he's affiliated with the Philippines before, of course. He was assigned, what was his title? The Supreme Commander of the Pacific Forces.
Yeah.
which included Korea. And so in Korea was a guy named John Hodge, who was under MacArthur. And MacArthur, on the day that they signed the peace treaty, September 2nd, he issues this declaration saying that, you know, the Koreans will remain. And I don't really think, I think he thought of it in the same way that he thought of the Japanese occupation. In other words, in Japan, you had Japanese telling Japanese what to do. So the Japanese, some people were purged, a lot were purged, but a lot were kept for that purpose. He felt he'd keep the people with experience, and then that. But the problem is that in Japan, when the Japanese told the Koreans what they had to do, the Koreans would not listen to him. And in Korea, when the Japanese told, or the Japanese, the people who helped the Japanese told the Koreans what to do, they didn't listen to them either. And so I don't really think he probably didn't put much thought into it, is my thinking. I've been to MacArthur's archives in Norfolk. I couldn't find anything relevant. I like a diary entry. Okay, we're going to put this in it was quickly, Truman quickly rescinded this and said you can't keep the Japanese there, but of course they did stay in a lesser role, a less visible role, okay? Intermarriage during the colonial period, you get some Japanese saying they have to work towards assimilation, and so they're going to marry a Korean. And or they have the idea that they're going to marry a Korean until they tell their family and their friends about it. And they quickly dropped that issue. There was talk during these discussions about people who Koreans who did marry Japanese, that they should be considered collaborators. This would be a very low level. Okay, it's a very personal level. They didn't really affect anybody more than each other. But if they talk Japanese in the house, should they be considered collaborators, even amongst Koreans? Okay, we're Japanese now, we're going to talk Japanese, was the thought of some Korean. And if you married a Japanese, but didn't gain much, it wasn't considered that important an issue. The biggest one was if you somehow, your actions affected those fighting for independence, so the police. And the guy that got the death penalty, the claim was he stopped these, he was doing his job basically. You're supposed to stop, keep peace in the community, and people who are trying to fight for independence were obviously not cooperating, and so you acted like a policeman, and you stopped this, and that was considered one of the biggest crimes. You know, anything you did to what's the word, prevent the independence movement from doing their job. Yeah, so I don't think marriages it was talked about, but I don't think it gained much credence in this. Maybe a slap on the wrist. Yes?
Yeah. First, thank you very much, and I would like to hear from you some time in the talk. And two questions about the social markers. You talked about social identity of the collaborator. So I was wondering if there's some kind of general trait you found among the stories. Would you say that the collaborators were more or less from certain groups, social groups, and gender issues? Were they women?
There were, well, Helen Kim is considered one of the notorious. She was the president of Ewha School. I don't think it was university then. And she had a big statue in the school, and the students were embarrassed that this person was a collaborator, so they covered her with paper or something. They covered, you know, they tried to get it taken down, actually. And
she was on the list.
Oh, yeah. And one of my students is writing a chapter on her, saying, you know, well, this is the question of do you collaborate in order to reach, to fulfill a higher goal, and that was, of course, women's education. And so you have to weigh the balances of each. But she's on the list, and there's probably other one, but not as many as men. You wouldn't get, I don't recall seeing any examples. I haven't looked as deep as perhaps, I don't think she has either, of, say, prostitutes or people who serve the Japanese in that capacity being considered collaborators, like the French. But I'm sure there are other...
There were prostitutes, there were, you know,
oh, yeah, there were, yeah.
With liaisons with German soldiers. Prostitutes were okay. They were getting, you know, just doing their job.
In France?
Yeah.
Well, France, they were paraded down the streets and embarrassed.
Not prostitutes, lovers.
Oh, lovers. Oh,
yeah.
Okay. Thank you. I was mistaken in that. Yeah. So that's where the marriage comes in. I don't think the Japanese ever did that. Perhaps because of the comfort women problem being intermixed with this, I don't know.
But it used to be such an extraordinary phenomenon. You're talking about a list of 30 or 40, that's practically nothing. But socially or culturally,
Yeah.
were there sanctions or anything against collaborators, even if the government did not interfere, did not put you on trial, did not send you to jail? Would people say, well, he's a collaborator, we don't talk to him, we don't marry
yes,
him?
of course.
So what
And
kind
most of the violence.
socially, what were the worst types of collaboration? Police
and government officials, at least judging by, so you read, I've got in my office, G2 reports that basically had a list of things that went on every day in South Korea. You had lists of attacks on government buildings, and most of them, they attacked this police station, or attacked this government office. And I'm assuming that they're talking about collaborators in the police. And so it wasn't, I don't know, as social ostracization, but mostly direct attacks on, by the left, mostly leftists on the conservative. This was a part of the everyday occurrences in Seoul and in the other cities. People warning the U.S. government.
We're talking the 40s or?
The
40s,
early
50s?
40s, 45, leading up to the war.
No, but these attacks are starting from
1945
and ending?
Until the 1946, you see 1947, yeah, and, all throughout. And then when they, especially what I mentioned, when they tried to, this 1947 legislation, the police basically said, anybody who supports it, we're going to take care of. And they actually took out Yoon Hyung, who was one of the main supporters of this, and they shot him days before the legislation was passed. So they were actually serious. The police were really worried about their jobs. Another angle of this one memoir I read about a guy that was working with Syngman Rhee, and Syngman Rhee wanted very strong presidential powers in the Constitution. This guy was working on the committee to draft the Constitution. He did not agree with Syngman Rhee, and immediately he was being stopped for his class. He worked with the government general. And so when he didn't work with Syngman Rhee, that's when the police started to, he got intimidated by the police. So there's a lot I'm still working on, but yes, and I don't know the personal relations as well. There might have been things going on as well that don't get recorded. You had another question, our first question?
About the, what are people said between people of higher social status and lower social status, and how they were accused or tried?
I haven't gone into the background of many of them, but I suspect.
Well, it's mostly government officials.
Yeah, people who had the affluence to go to school and to reach these positions, or the connections, which would suggest that they had some wealth or something to protect. I guess is perhaps, but I don't have confidence in that answer yet.
What would Koreans consider the worst crime against Korean people perpetrated by the Japanese?
By the discussions, it's people who physically stopped independence, killing independence, people fighting for independence, or involved in anti-Japanese movements.
How many are we talking about? How many casualties?
Hundreds,
thousands, hundreds of thousands?
I would probably say hundreds. I'm not thinking hundreds of thousands, no.
100?
Yeah, I would say at the most hundreds. But that's a ballpark figure, yeah.
Right.
There's many people outside of Korea that were fighting in Manchuria and things like that, but these were people in Japan, or in Korea rather.
Right. Last question.
It's taking us a bit
Just
of,
introduce yourself.
I'm a PhD candidate in historical studies, and I'm researching history and teaching in Israel, specifically the state religious education system. And I'm wondering, it's a bit taking us away from the subject of this presentation, but regarding your work, how it's to research difficult paths in Japan, like to work in a Japanese university and to research difficult paths. I know it's a problematic issue, and you mentioned a bit the textbooks, controversies? So if you can please.
Let's see. Personally, I've never felt that talking about this in Japan or out, that you get people who disagree with you, of course, but that's your opinion. It's okay. Like I mentioned, that Okinawa was a colony once, and this Japanese family said, "No, we don't consider it that." Well, that's it's a difference of opinion. I think people in Okinawa might have a different opinion than you, but nothing more than that. They made. I think you get away with a lot if you're, excuse the expression, a white foreigner, than if you're a Japanese or even a Korean. Now, in saying that, if teaching at a city university in Hiroshima, there is a Korean who was looking into delicate issues, shall we say. They found something she did. She misappropriated some research money, spent the wrong way. They had her arrested and canceled her, fired her from her job, and things like this, which would never happen to a Japanese, I'm sure. And it seems they were looking. She called it, her dean told her she should be studying more appropriate topics for a Korean woman, whatever the heck that means. So it's there. And there are groups that monitor people who are looking at these issues. I've had my name mentioned in a few of these groups. My friend in Connecticut, Alexis Dudden, maybe some of you might know her, swears that they have a death penalty on her, but she exaggerates anything. But they are monitoring this and worried. So it depends on the political favor. When I talk in class, this is what I think. You don't like it. You don't have to believe me. And then some people, a lot of students disagree, but that's okay. But I've never felt, at least at the university level, maybe there may be some talk that I'm not aware of, but yeah.
Thanks a lot.
Well,
thank you very much.
I hope I earned the treatment you've provided me over this last few days.